Hello! Today we're going to be taking a look at 1979 Revolution in Iran from Dietz Foundation. This is a national level strategy game, card-driven game for two players. One player is going to be playing as the Royalist faction, the other is the Coalition. Coalition player represents factions pushing to nationalize the oil industry from 51 to 53, and many of the same forces that are going to rise to oppose the Shah and remove him from power during the Islamic Revolution. And the Royalist player represents the interests of the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, as well as American and British oil interests. So the objective for both players is going to be to remain in power for as long as possible to fulfill their agenda while overthrowing the opposition. Additionally, the coalition is able to achieve a sudden victory condition if Iran seizes control of its oil industry. To start, I want to point out some of the features we have on our board. So we have a map of Iran that's divided primarily into locations or cities. And then we have a couple special areas on the map. One, this red region here in the upper northwest is Azerbaijan. That's a separate space that units and influence tokens can be placed in. And then finally, there is an oil resource location located between Abadan and Isfahan. Two of our cities are singled out with iconography here. Abadan and Bandar Abbas are both oil resource cities, meaning that they can be sites for oil strikes in addition to this oil resource area. Additionally, we have our military influence supply space and SAVAK unit supply space located on the board. Then we have the CIA MI6 event box, where cards will be placed throughout the game, as well as the Royal Estates box, another area where cards can be played. We have an event and activity tracker that tracks primarily the events that often have a prerequisite or will affect other events or scoring. And then we've got the Royals card buried, Coalition card buried, and Estate established boxes here in the tracker as well. That is because these three things can only occur once per turn. And then we have overflow boxes in case it gets too crowded in any of our city areas. And then as we turn our attention to the rest of the board, we've got a turn track, turns number 1 through 7. Support and opposition is tracked alongside our leader and power box, where there will be a leader card in there at all times, signifying which faction has a leader currently active. And then we have nationalization, and that tracks the state of the Iranian oil industry. It'll begin in AIOC control, which is Anglo-Iranian Oil Company control, and then slowly move toward National Iranian Oil Control, or NIOC control. And then we've got a space to track reserves for both the Royalists and the Coalition players, and an active event box for each player as well. More on that later in our video. I want to give a quick rundown of the various types of influence you'll encounter in 1979. First and foremost is military influence. So military influence is the primary influence that provides support for the Royalist player. Military influence is represented by white cubes. It all has a value of 1. And military influence is the only influence that can be moved from one city or locale to another. That influence is moved in the early era along these connections or lines of adjacency, and in the late era it can be moved to any other location with activities. The other forms of influence tokens are represented by these two-sided wooden counters. They'll have an icon on their ready side, and then on the reverse side that has a value, that is the active side for that influence. Influence that is ready is capable of performing activities, but influence that is active can no longer perform activities. It just provides a base of support or opposition for one player or another. Bazari influence represents the merchant class. Ulama influence represents the clergy of Iran. Both these influence types enter the game via event cards. And then Toiler's Party and Resurgence Party influence also enter the game via event cards. At the start of the game, the Coalition player is going to have a draw pool that they'll put either in a cup or a bag, something where they can basically draw blind from it. All the green and red influence tokens are going to be placed in that draw pool. The green influence represents National Front, which is the formal coalition of Mossadegh during the nationalization movement, and then the red influence tokens represent the Today Party or Communist Party of Iran. There are 10 Today Party tokens in the coalition draw pool, and there are 20 National Front influence tokens. What would a CDG be without event cards? Let's take a look at ours here in 1979. So event cards have a value in the upper left corner between 1 and 3. And then we have 3 different associations for event cards. Red event cards, cards with a red band on them, are coalition events. Cards with the white band are royalist events, and then our green band cards are unassociated events, which means that either the royalist or the coalition player is able to play an unassociated event for its event effect. Otherwise, it's up to you as the player owning the event to decide whether or not you're going to trigger its event effect. When I'm an active player during my action round, if I'm, say, the coalition and I am playing a royalist event card, I'm only using the activity points on my turn. However, the royalist player will have an opportunity to trigger this event. I, as the acting player, will be able to decide whether they get this opportunity before I take my activities or after. Our events have different kind of lingering effects depending on the type. Most events are single fire events, meaning there's nothing special identifying them as personalities or active events. These event cards, when we trigger them for their event effect, they are placed in the out of play area and don't make another appearance again. However, a personality card, when you play that card for its event effect, it will remain in play for the rest of its era. Sometimes it's good to crowd these around the board on the table, or even place them directly on the board if there's room, just to kind of designate, hey, these guys are in play. A personality card remains for its era, so this is an early era event, Ayatollah Kashani here, so he would stay in play for turns 1 through 3. Late era personalities would remain in play turns 4 through 7. And then we've got our active events. Active event cards are played to the active event box on the board down here, lower corner, where we see the little flag icon. So if I were triggering the Harriman mission here, I would play it in the active event box, and it would provide a benefit for the remainder of that turn. During the resolution phase of each turn, which we'll get into in a little bit, any active events are cleared out of this box, and then they get placed in the out of play area. Only one active event can benefit a player at any given time. So if I get another royalist event that I like better than Harriman mission during a turn, I can trigger that event effect. However, it's going to unseat Harriman mission and send it to the out of play area immediately. In addition to these different types of events, there's some special iconography to look out for. These personality cards that belong to the royalists in the early era will often have a CIA MI6 icon on them, but all kinds of events can have CIA MI6 event icons on them. When those event cards are played for their event effect, once they would be placed in the out of play box, instead of doing that as normal, you would place them in the CIA MI6 event box. These cards impact the final score for the royalist player unless they are purged with a special activity. So you want to keep those in this box and make sure they don't get removed from play in their entirety until they've been dealt with. Many of the personalities in the early era have that CIA MI6 icon on them, so you'll want to keep an eye out for that. Altogether different than our event cards are the leader cards. Leader cards will begin the game placed like next to the board. They don't get shuffled into the event decks, and Mossadegh is going to be in the leader and power box. He begins play representing the coalition faction as the leader in power. There's a lot of important text on each one of these leader cards. They'll include things like benefits to scoring. special capabilities in the case of Shah, or actions that you're able to do when he's in power. And then it'll also indicate conditions under which support would be lowered during the resolution phase of each turn, and conditions that need to be met in order to trigger your faction's events when played by your opponent. General rule, if you have a leader in power, it's going to cost you some influence or political capital in order to trigger an event when it's played by your opponent. Unlike when you're holding your event, you're able to just play that as an option during your action round. And finally, a very important note on the bottom of Mossadeg's card, at the start of turn 4, which ushers in the late era of the game, you'll remove Mossadegh if he's still the leader in power and replace him with the Shah. So his removal is inevitable at the start of the late era. We're going to go through the turn sequence to kind of get a sense of the flow of the game. So each turn is going to begin with the draft phase. During the draft phase, each player is going to draw up to a hand of 8 cards. And from the hand that they are dealt, they're going to select one card that is going to be part of their starting hand, and the remainder of the cards are going to be passed to their opponent. This should be done simultaneously, so that way each player has no sense of what the remainder of the contents of that deck are until they've drafted their first card. You're going to go back and forth, passing the hand of cards to one another until each player has drafted their full hand of 8 cards, and then the action phase will begin, starting play with the player who has a leader in power. The first coalition activity I want to point out is placing influence. So placing influence is going to be drawn from the coalition draw pool. Again, I said earlier in the video, you're going to want to have a bag or a draw cup that you can put all of your green and red influence tokens into. Those are going to form your initial draw pool. So when you're placing influence, the first thing you do as the coalition is you designate the place. Where is the influence going to go? So in this case, let's say we're going to place our influence here in Bandar Yavuz. So the first point I spend is to place an influence token there. And I place this influence out. And then as the coalition player, I can actually inspect this influence token to see what the value is. But it's going to be done so in secret. So the royalist player isn't going to see what the value of that influence is. Having seen that influence, I can place now my second one. Now I can place this anywhere in any city or location on the map, direct from my pool, but I always need to designate first. So my next influence could go elsewhere, but I'd have to point out, hey, I'm going to place this in Shiraz before drawing there. I actually want to place my second one in Bandar Yavuz again. So I'm spending my second point there. I'll draw from the bag and place, and then I'm going to inspect it just because I want to see what I've got going on there. And then after my points are spent, then that would end my turn. If I want, I can always mix and match the activity types that I'm doing until I've spent everything from my card or invested it. But you are not locked into only doing one specific type of activity. You can do anything that you can afford to perform. So as long as you have the AP available, you can just keep performing actions. So the second activity I want to highlight is oil strikes. Oil strikes are pretty helpful because they allow the coalition to move the nationalization track over toward NIOC control, or alternatively, they can lower support. In the early era, you're not going to be lowering support much while Mossadegh is in power because he's your guy and you want him to remain in power. However, you are going to be trying to push the nationalization track further to the right. So in order to do that, we're going to need to do a labor strike. When we're doing a labor strike, 2 things we're looking for. You need to be doing that in an oil resource city or location. There are 3 of them, the one between Isfahan and Abadan, and then we have Abadan and Bandar Yavuz. So as long as you're performing the action in one of those 3 locations, you can do an oil strike. And second, you need to have a red influence token being activated when performing an oil strike. So in Bandar Yavuz, we have a red today party influence, so we are going to need to activate that in order to perform the oil strike. So here's the procedure. I need to activate influence tokens by spending 1 AP per influence token I'm flipping over. So in this case, I'm activating 2, so I'm going to spend a total of 2 points from this card by activating both. So now that I've spent my 2 AP to activate these two, I have a 5 strength oil strike that I'm going to be performing. Then the Royalist player is actually going to be the one that rolls the die here. So they're going to roll a die, and they're trying to equal or exceed the total influence that was activated to perform the oil strike. And they can modify this roll in a couple ways. One is that if they have any military influence presence whatsoever in the location, they will add 1 to their roll. It doesn't matter whether this is 1 cube or 20, they're only going to get to add 1 to their roll. And second, they can kick in any points from their Royalist reserves to modify the die roll by 1 per point that they spend from their reserves. So in this case, they don't have any reserves to spend, so they're just going to be adding the 1 for the military presence, and that's it. So we'll roll a die. Our total is 4, but with that military influence there, they would have a total of 5. So they've met this, and that would mean that the oil strike has failed. But let's say that the result is less than the activated influence. That would be an oil strike success. So what do we do for an oil strike success? First thing we do is we would move the nationalization track over 1 to the right. And then finally, the oil strike marker among your event tokens should be placed on the 3 in the coalition reserves if there is no oil strike marker in the reserves box already. If it was already out and placed on the 3, and then we had a future success on the oil strike, we would move it over 1. This is effectively a cap on the amount of coalition reserves that you can have at any one time. And this marker will be removed at the end of the era. So a labor strike is very similar mechanically to an oil strike, but it doesn't have the same constraints. Namely, you can do it in any city regardless of whether or not it's an oil location. And second, you don't have to have a red influence token in that city in order to perform a labor strike. Now, labor strikes are for increasing opposition, so you're not going to want to perform them when you have most Dagon power, but when the Shah comes to power, that is going to be something you're going to be doing a lot of. So when performing a labor strike, it's very similar mechanically. You'd be spending 1 AP per influence token you want to activate. However, when you're performing labor strikes, you can actually involve the Bazari influence as well as your other influence tokens. So that's kind of nice. So for 2 AP, you'd flip over 2 influence tokens. So we're going to go with those, roll with those 2. So now we have a total of 4 strength for our labor strike. And then again, the Royalist player is going to roll a die. They get to modify their roll by 1 from any military influence presence. They have presence, so they'd add 1 in this case. And then they still have no reserves, but they would be able to spend points from their reserves to add to their die roll as well. So if they roll, if they had a success, then nothing happens. Essentially, the Royalists have put down this labor strike before it had any kind of political fallout. However, if the roll had been lower than the activated influence, then the opposition would be increased by 1. But additionally, in a labor strike, unlike an oil strike, the coalition player then rolls a die to determine how much influence or how many reserve points are lost from the Royalist reserves. On a result of 1 to 3, the Royalists are just going to lose 1 point. On a 4 to 5, they'll lose 2 points. And on a roll of 6, they'll lose all the points that they have stored in their Royalist reserves. So I want to cover the final 2 activities that you can perform as the coalition. So mass demonstration is something that you won't use a lot, but it is typically a pretty strong way to end a turn on one of your final action round or final 2 action rounds, to flip influence to active in order to provide a base of support heading into the resolution phase of a turn. And we'll go over why that's important when we discuss the stability phase and the resolution phase in a little bit. But when you perform a mass demonstration, for 1 AP, you can activate as much influence as you want in any one city or location and flip it over to its active side. And then this influence, now that it's active, it won't be able to perform activities in the future, but it is providing you a base of support of 5. And that can be important because it'll prevent your support from slipping downward when you have a leader in power, or force the other player, your opponent, to activate more of their influence or try to mobilize more influence to offset the fact that now you have more of a support base out on the map. So that's mass demonstration. And then finally, there's guerrilla strikes. So guerrilla strikes won't be available until the late era of the game, but it's a means for you to target military influence in spaces where you have guerrilla units and try to remove them from the map. Now, guerrillas are units, not influence, so they don't have a value that you're flipping over to reveal. Instead, what you're going to do when you target a military influence token with a guerrilla strike, you're going to roll a die, and if you have a roll of 4 or better, that will be enough to remove that one influence token and place it back in the supply. If there was a Savak unit here, and again, that's because this is a late era action, if there's a Savak unit present, they kind of provide another layer of protection for the military influence that's located in that spot. So you would need a 5 or better in order to successfully remove this influence. However, when you successfully do that, not only do you remove the military influence, but you'll also add 1 point to the coalition reserves. Now, any points that are added to reserves cannot be spent in the same turn that they're added. So bear in mind that if you are trying to avoid forfeiting points because you're already maxed out on your reserves, you're going to want to spend from your reserves first just to make sure there's a little space to pick up those extra points for successful guerrilla strikes. Let's run through some royalist activities. So to start, placing military influence is a little bit more straightforward than what the coalition are doing. You could place military influence on any map location provided that there is already military influence there, and it costs 1 AP per influence placed. Pretty simple, right? Additionally, unlike all the other influence types in the game, you're able to mobilize military influence. During the early eras of the game, military influence can only be mobilized across these white lines connecting locations. So it would cost 1 AP to move, say, this influence cube from Tehran to Mashhad. However, in the late era of the game, influence is basically able to move from any one place to any other place. And that's kind of to highlight the importance of the infrastructure that's been built all over the country that wasn't really there prior to 1954. So the idea there is that this is your means of being able to move influence into a neighboring location, and then from there you'll be able to add future influence to Mashhad, but otherwise you'd have no way to get that influence for the military into these spaces. So that's mobilizing military influence. A lot of our other actions are going to be based off of meeting certain conditions that are out on the board. So, for example, the Purge Documents action, you won't use it a ton. However, over the course of the game, you're going to get some of these CIA MI6 event cards building up in the event box. For each one of these cards that is in this box at game end, it's -1 to your final score as the Royalist. So you don't want to have these lingering around in here too long. And when you have the points to get rid of them, you definitely want to be able to spend them. So you can do a Purge Documents action, and it costs 1 AP per value of the card. So for the Bebehani dollars that is event that's sitting in the CIA MI6 box right now, it would cost me 2 AP to remove this card from the event box. Anytime you do the Purge Documents action and pay those points, then that card gets removed from the box and just placed and out of play. So you don't have to deal with it ever again. That's Purge Documents. We are going to have in the late era some other things, some other options for activities. Some of them are going to come in the way of different personality events that offer capabilities for us. One of them that's really important is actually on our Shah leader card. So the Shah, when he's in power, he'll allow you to establish estates. And establishing estates is something only the Royalist player can do, and only once the Shah is in power. So if you're able to get the Shah in power in the early era, you'll be able to establish estates early, but it is a very costly action. It's very similar to burying a card, but the difference is when you establish estates, you're going to be spending 3 AP to bury the card here in the Royal Estates box. So that basically means you'd spend 3 AP, and then from one card that you're playing. So let's say I played this card. Spend 3 AP to establish estates, and then I would take another card from my hand and I would bury it face down so the coalition player can't see what I just buried in the estates box, and place it in there. This is going to score for me at the end of game as the royalist. And I can do this once per turn. But it's a pretty costly action, because in addition to the 3 AP that you had to spend in order to bury this card in your estates, you're also going to be short one more card out of your hand. So it's going to be giving your opponent more opportunities to play back-to-back in the later action rounds. So it's something to keep an eye out for. In addition to the estates, these aren't quite like the cards that are buried under a leader, because when you bury a card under a leader, there's nothing that will be able to take those points away from you. Those are essentially banked. But royal estates, there are a couple of cards that will mess with these. So royal estates are susceptible to a land reform event, which can be very devastating to the royalist player, and either it will discard an event card that was banked previously in the royal estates and established, or it'll be if it's revealed as a coalition event, it will actually score for the coalition instead of for the royalist. So you have to be really careful about burying your opponent's events in the royal estates, whereas burying them under our leader cards, it's a little bit safer to diffuse those events there. And then the final activity I want to highlight for the royalists is removing guerrillas. So when you remove guerrillas with this royalist activity, again, this is only going to be a late era activity, because this is targeting guerrillas, and guerrillas don't enter the game until turn 4 and later. So when you're doing a remove guerrilla action, what you're going to do is you're going to be rolling a die to remove a guerrilla. Each guerrilla can only be targeted once with this activity. It costs 1 AP to target a single guerrilla, but you're essentially going to roll a die, and you're looking to roll equal to or less than the number of military influence you have in the space. When you successfully remove a guerrilla, it goes back to the supply, and additionally, you're going to reduce the coalition reserves if possible by 1. Now, Savak units can also help with this activity. They provide a little bit of an added boost. If you look at your player aid, it'll kind of highlight this. So when you look at remove guerrilla action, it's less than or equal to the total military influence plus Savak units in the area. So you'd count them as if they were military influence for that role. So that's pretty helpful. Activities that either player might be capable of include a couple things. Very important is being able to invest points in reserves. So anytime you've got points that you're using to conduct your other activities, and you've got some leftover points from a card that you didn't spend, you always have the option of placing them in your reserves. You can even place the entirety of a card directly into reserves. Those points can't be spent until future turns, however, future action rounds. However, these points can never exceed the limit of 3, and in the case of the royalist or a coalition player, they can never exceed wherever the oil strike marker has capped the reserves. Those reserves are really beneficial because obviously we've seen already that they can modify die rolls for labor strikes and union strikes if you happen to be the royalist. And for the coalition, they're great because when you store those points, you can add them to future action rounds as activities, which will allow you to trigger even more than 3 influence tokens in a space and create an almost insurmountable margin to be able to perform labor strikes or oil strikes, depending. So they're very helpful in that way. In addition, the other activity that you'll have access to if you have a leader in power, regardless of which faction you are, is burying a card. So if you are the coalition and you have Mossadegh in power, you'll be able to bury 1 card per turn underneath Mossadegh. Anytime you do that, obviously you place it face down underneath your leader card, and then you would mark that you have buried a card, because you can only do this action once per turn. And then when the leader is removed from power, that card will follow him out. So it'll stay underneath his card, and we don't reveal those cards that were buried until final scoring. After both players have played every card in their hand, that would conclude the action phase, and we proceed to the stability phase. During the stability phase, we'll be conducting a stability check. Each player is going to roll a d6, adding either support or opposition to their roll. The player with the leader in power will be adding support. The player without is going to be adding opposition. So they'll roll d6, and then after rolling their result, they're going to add their opposition or support to their roll. So in this case, our opposition final result is 5, and our support final result is 1. If the opposition exceeds the support result, that would force the leader in power to be removed. You'd take any cards that are tucked underneath them with them and set them aside until final scoring, and then you'd replace them with the next leader in line. So in the case of Mossadegh being removed from power, he would be replaced by the Shah. However, the player with the leader in power has the option of forcing both players to re-roll their results, but in order to do that, an amount of influence needs to be paid equal to the difference between the final results. So in this case, because the final results are 5 and 1, the coalition player would need to remove a total of 4 influence from the board. That influence would need to be their influence. In the case of the coalition, that means red or green influence tokens. In the case of the royalist player, when initiating a recheck, when they have a leader in power, they would need to remove military influence. And only the player with a leader in power can force a re-roll of the stability check. So in this instance, the coalition player is going to remove their 4 influence points here in Boundary Abyss, and then place them back in the coalition draw pool. After that, we would roll a die, royalists would roll a die, and in this case, now we've got a favorable result. The coalition has 6, royalist has a total of 5, and then we proceed to the next phase. However, if the coalition had lost that roll as well, they can keep triggering more and more stability checks and re-rolling the result as long as they have sufficient influence to pay to have both of those dice re-rolled. During the course of the action phase, there are going to be instances where you'll be conducting stability checks. Some event cards will explicitly say to conduct a stability check, but in other instances, if support is ever supposed to be lowered, like in an oil strike or from an event effect, but it can't because it's at 0, or if opposition would need to be increased because of an event effect or because of a labor strike, and it can't because it's already maxed at 3, in those instances, there would be a stability check conducted. Anytime there is more than one condition being met in the same action round to conduct stability checks, you only ever conduct one stability check per action round. Meaning, if you had an event with the effect conduct a stability check and increase opposition by 1, you would only conduct one of those stability checks, not 2. Finally, each turn is going to conclude with the resolution phase. We're going to use this turn 2 example here. So we have Mossadegh as our leader in power. So when we're conducting our support check during the resolution phase, we're going to look at our leader card to see what conditions need to be met. In the case of Mossadegh here, he has dwindling oil revenue. This is the second paragraph on his leader card. At the end of each turn, support is reduced by 1 if today and National Front influence is less than all other combined influence. So looking at the board, we can see there's very little red and green influence here. We have a total of 6 points worth of coalition influence out on the board, while conversely we have 11 military influence scattered throughout the map. And then we also have a smattering of some Bazari influence and even a little bit of a Lama influence out here too. So all the combined influence overwhelmingly exceeds what little coalition influence we have, so we would reduce the support by 1. In this instance here, we have an example where support is already at 0. So while support can't be reduced any further, this would actually trigger a stability check. After conducting the stability check, then we would clear any active events out of our event box and move them to the out of play area. And then we proceed setting up turn 3. after either Ayatollah Khomeini has come into power or the game has just concluded its 7th turn, we're going to do our final scoring. So the first thing we're going to look at for determining final scores for each of our players is the cards buried underneath our leader. You're going to total those cards based on their values and then add those to their score respectively. In the case of the coalition player, Mossadegh's leader card states that for each coalition event buried under him, he's going to get an extra victory point. So in our little example here of cards that are buried under our leaders, the Shah would have a total of 11 points to add to his score. And then looking at Mossadegh's cards, we see that the values add up to 10, but then we have 2 coalition events buried under him, so he'd have a total of 12 points added to his final score. Beyond these cards, each player role is going to have slightly different things that factor into their scoring. I'm going to start with the coalition first. So in addition to the cards that are buried underneath Mossadegh, we're going to look to see if any hostage crisis events were played during the course of the game. They'll have influence tokens placed on them based on the text of the card, and those tokens are not face up revealing their value until we conduct final scoring. So in this case, this hostage crisis event is worth a total of 2 points, so we would add that to the coalition score. Next, we would look in Tehran to see if there are any guerrilla units present. In this case, there is a guerrilla unit present, so we would add another victory point to the score. It doesn't matter how many guerrilla units are in that space, it's only ever worth a maximum of 1 victory point. And then finally, looking in our leader and power box, we see that Khomeini being in power adds 5 VP to the coalition player's final score, so that would get us to a total of 20 victory points. Now let's look at the remaining royalist points. So the royalist player has 2 event cards in the CIA MI6 box. It doesn't matter what their values are. The royalist player is going to lose 1 victory point per event card in that box at the end of the game. Next, we look in the Royal Estates box. There are 2 guards buried there right now, and they have a total value of 4. So we're going to be adding 4 points to the royalist score. Then we'll check the nationalization track to see what the current status is of nationalization. In this case, it's on the 2 space, so that would add 2 victory points to the royalist score. And finally, if the Siakal incident event was played during the course of the game, we check the Azerbaijan region to see if there is more military influence present in that red region than there are guerrillas in that space. In this case, there are, so it would prevent a loss of 2 victory points because we have enough military presence there. If that event were not played during the course of the game, we do not need to check the Azerbaijan region at all for this loss of points. And then this is our final score. We have a final score of 20 for coalition and 15 for the royalist. Now, if the 2 scores were tied, the coalition player would win if Khomeini was in power at the end of the game. However, the royalist player would win if the Shah had remained in power and the scores were tied. And that's final scoring for 1979. Finally, we're going to take a look at the steps that we're going to take to set up the late era of the game at the top of turn 4. So the first thing we're going to be doing is we're going to look at the influence that are on our map. All active orange Bazari influence and active Ulama, the black influence tokens that are out on the map, are going to be removed and then placed back in the supply. Any of the ready influence tokens of these types will remain out on the map where they are. Next, all Toiler's Party influence tokens, that's these, are going to be removed from the map and placed in the out of play area, and any that were in the supply will also be placed in the out of play area. For the remainder of the game, anytime the coalition player does the place influence activity and draws a Toiler's Party influence token, it will just be placed in the out of play area. The AP will be spent and there will be no effect. Next, we'll take the oil strike token if it's out on the reserves, and that gets removed from the board. It can be placed again on the reserves only if there's a future oil strike activity performed. Next step is we are going to be cleaning up any of the personality event cards that are out in play right now will be placed in the out of play area. So for the coalition player, they have Fatemi, so that personality card would be removed. However, for Ayatollah Kashani and Shaban Jafari, we've got two personalities that are CIA MI6 events as well. So instead of going to the out of play box, those cards are going to be placed in the CIA MI6 box, and in order to be removed, they'll need to be the target of a purge documents activity, as we talked about earlier in this video. Any cards, event cards that are in the discard will now be placed in the out of play area. Our early era events will not be returning to play at all. And then we'll take a look at the coalition influence, our red and green tokens. Any national front that are active out on the map are going to be pulled from their locations and then placed back into the coalition draw pool. So in this case, we've got 4 such tokens, so those can be placed back in the draw bag or cup. And then any today party influence tokens, our red ones that are active, are going to be removed from the map, but those influence tokens are going to be placed in the out of play area. From now on, anytime the coalition is performing a place influence action and a today party influence token is drawn, that influence token will be placed in the out of play area. The AP will be spent, but there will be no effect. And then finally, if Mossadegh is still the leader in power, you'll remove Mossadegh's leader card and any cards buried under him, and then replace him with the Shah. When the Shah is placed in the leader in power box, place support at 3 and opposition at 0, and you're ready to start the draft for turn 4. Turn 4's draft is special because there are 2 Royalist event cards that the Royalist player can decide to choose to have in their hand at the very start. That is Savak and the Consortium Agreement of 1954. They may elect to take neither, both, or either one of these events. If they choose any of these events, those will be the first cards drafted during this draft phase. And then you would deal them a number of cards to get them to a hand of 8. The coalition, as normal, will just receive a hand of 8 cards. If both of these cards were selected by the Royalist player, then the coalition is going to be able to draft 2 cards in the first round of the draft instead of the ordinary 1. You'll pass the remaining cards that are undrafted to your opponent and then proceed with the remainder of the draft as normal. And that is 1979 Revolution in Iran. If you have any rule questions, feel free to post them on the BGG forums. I will be combing that for quite a while, and I'll be available to answer any of your questions. Enjoy.